Hello and welcome back to the EduPulse podcast. In this episode, we feature our new item, In Conversation With, a series of talks and conversations with people right at the heart of education and thinking. In today's episode, In Conversation with David Didau. Good afternoon, David, and welcome to the EduPulse podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
You're very, very welcome. Now, for some of our listeners out there who may have spent some of their education under a rock, is there any chance that you might be able to give us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you've done, and why you're with us today?
Okay. Well, I'm an English teacher by training. I currently work for Ormiston Academies Trust as their English lead, and I've been it's 20 odd years since I qualified as a teacher, and in the last 10-15 years or so I've written lots of social media posts, blog posts, books, and generally made a bit of a nuisance of myself, I think.
And now listen, we are fond of nuisance making here at EduPulse. It's quite important, making ripples as we like to call it. So, yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm going to cut out all the awkward gaps when we make sure we're not talking over each other. So we wrote this question down and sent it to you, and Adam and I were discussing this. How do you feel about having this status as one of education's most influential voices? Do you feel that you have that? Do you recognise that? Or is that not something you identify with at all?
I mean, I don't know. No, in my day-to-day life, I don't think anyone it doesn't feel like anyone's very impressed with me. So I think there's a sort of tiny sort of education circle in which I'm a sort of C-list celebrity. That's how I feel.
But listen, C is definitely higher than D, and we, when Adam and I have been discussing this podcast, and you are our first In Conversation With, and we've mentioned it to a couple of people, they've gone, really? David Didau, that's impressive. And we've kind of gone, yeah, listen, we've got his book, Bringing the English Curriculum to Life, and we want to chat about it, and he's there, and I'm from Birmingham, so let's have a bit of a chat. And they're like, okay, that's amazing. But they are in a little bit of awe of you.
Okay.
I think we might just have to accept that's what that is. Is there anything?
That's very odd. I mean, I think the interesting. I started sort of blogging and got on Twitter in what was it, sort of 2011 and 12, in the sort of early days of edu Twitter, and it was just right time, right place. That I was writing a blog, which I'd been writing a blog for years before that about books and films, and nobody ever read it. Started writing about education, and much to my pleasure, found that there was a readership of people who'd engage with it. And yeah, I just think it wasn't a very crowded marketplace back then, and so it was relatively easy to establish yourself and get your voice heard. And so I had offers from publishers and things like that as a result of being out there with a big gob.
Well, listen, if that's how we're going to get our voices heard, the ones with the loudest voices get heard the most, why not? What do you think it is about either your writing style or the things that you want to write about that has kind of inspired that readership? Because it has. You've got a big fan base.
I don't know. I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to ask about that, Chris. But I think in terms of as someone with a keen interest in books and literature, I'm very much interested in style and do take care to write well. And I don't know, naming no names, I've sometimes found that some of the books that I've read in education circles are not a beautiful, easy read. And so I think when somebody compliments me on the way in which things are written, I take more pleasure from that than the content of them. But I think that in terms of content, I think that I made my name such as it is by saying things which teachers had felt unable to say or unlistened to. And so, for instance, I did quite a bit of railing against the way Ofsted inspections were run. and things like lesson observations and and how nonsensical things like that were. And I think lots of that chimed with the lived experience of ordinary teachers, and I think it was that period in time when, for the first time ever, it was possible for somebody who was just an ordinary teacher to have a voice and a sort of access, which had never really happened before. I remember back in, I think maybe 2012, being invited to Sanctuary House, Ofsted Towers,
yes, of course,
with Tom Sherrington and Tom Bennett and a couple of other people to talk about the way Ofsted was perceived, and it just felt I just kept sort of pinching myself.
Yeah, surrounded by some voices which even now are quite, well, they're quite seminal, aren't they? They're out there, and they're the voices that the people listen to, and in those circles. Well, that's very humble of you, Adam. Did you have a question? We can hear your bird song. For listeners out there, Adam is on the, I want to say on the run, but I don't mean on the run. Adam is out in the world. He's like Challenge Annika.
Yeah, I haven't committed any crimes or anything like that. I can guarantee it. No, I just wanted to say, David, I think that from my perspective, I think that your work kind of transcends particular sectors or particular parts of the sector. So you're writing a particular what if everything you knew about education was wrong? It's kind of one of those works that speaks to every teacher, no matter what your context is, no matter what kind of school you work in, what year group or key stage you teach. And I think that's probably quite a big aspect and quite a big element of your work. The fact that it does go right the way across the sector and adds huge value in lots of different places. Was that your kind of intention? Is that your intention with the writing that you put out?
No, it's not. I mean, things I've only ever written about what interests me, and I feel that I'm remarkably bad at sort of guessing what will sell. For instance, I think there's some great. If you want sort of lessons on that, there's some much more astute people out there than I am. So when I wrote that book, it was I guess the pulling together of a few years of having sort of felt things that I felt were sort of unsatisfactory, and done a lot of reading and met a lot of people and been introduced to all sorts of areas of research, and I just felt that if I had an opportunity to pull that together in a way which I don't think had quite been done in that way before. So obviously, I think there were people who've drawn comparisons with Daisy Christodoulou's book, 7 Myths, which obviously was out a few years before, and I'd obviously read and been influenced by. But I think that that which I think that's a great book. I really, really like it, and she sort of does this wonderful job of laying out her evidence in a very methodical, careful way, and sort of being really never sort of overstating claims and building up a real picture. And I think what I did in the What If book was, it was a bit more. It was a bit more about the feels. It was a bit more about the experience of what that people working in schools would recognise. And I was also really, really careful. Sort of even back then, there was a tribal nature to education debate, and people would be, very aggressively defensive of their particular point of view. So I wanted to be really, really careful not to savage anything, and not to speak ill of anything or anyone. And I've always tried to be quite carefully to do that. Again, I'm not sure everyone that I've interacted with over the years has tried to do that with the same care, but so maybe it's that, I don't know.
Well, one of the things that one of the reasons why Adam and I set up EduPulse was to try two things, really. It was to add a bit of nuance to the argument. So much on edu Twitter is binary in nature. It's good versus evil. If you think one thing and you don't think the opposite, you are the hero or the villain. And there's very, very rarely a voice trying to say, to defend the grey area, as it were. But also EduPulse is about trying to bring linking classroom and theory, which is why our podcast is aimed at kind of our initial teacher trainer and early career teacher colleagues, because it's important to get in at the beginning of somebody's career, no matter at what time in their life they are becoming a teacher, and try and get those conversations happening. And we are in the middle of writing our own book for Bloomsbury, Succeeding as a Deputy Head, as part of their Succeeding As range. And one of the challenges we're finding at the moment is, as you say, trying not to put up a flagpole that's too overbearing and too opinionated, but one that speaks to the human experience without calling out things that we see that are wrong too badly, because the idea of trying to tie down what on earth the deputy head does is quite a difficult job, and one of the reasons why we actually set up going about the book.
Yeah, I think to be for clarity, I think it's fine to call out things that you disagree with, and I think it's fine to nail your colours to a mast. I think that it's worth taking care of to do that in a way which brings people with you, and
absolutely
tries to build consensus and tries to sort of reach common ground. But and I've got better at that over the years. Back in the day, I found myself getting into lots of arguments online, and I don't do that anymore.
No, it's very rarely worth it unless you find yourself in a discussion where you immediately feel some kind of reciprocal relationship, or there's a respect or something that is coming both ways. Otherwise, it's a slanging match into the middle of nowhere, isn't it? It's just Twitter, because you come off it and go and have your dinner.
One of the things that I felt over the years is that I'm aware that there's an unseen, unheard majority, who are listening, and are certainly in the past. I don't know if that's still the case now, but certainly in the past, there would I've often had people who say things like, "Well, I follow you on Twitter, but I've never tweeted. I don't interact." So I'm really, really aware that there are people out there who listen and watch the debates taking place. So it really strikes me that it's important to conduct yourself with the appropriate respectfulness and courtesy, because there's nothing more alienating to observers than someone behaving like a dick.
Completely.
So I think that's important.
I think that's don't be a dick. I think it's a great piece of advice. I do wonder, therefore, our key audience that we are trying to speak to is our ICT and ECT colleagues.
Yeah.
What do you think are the priorities for high quality teacher training? What should they be focusing on as they seek to enter this very wonderful and privileged world?
Well, it's interesting. My eldest daughter, is doing a BEd in primary education, and so she just finished her first placement, and is really enjoying the school-based stuff, and not enjoying quite anywhere near as much the university-based stuff. And I think it's really, really important to bear in mind that the job is in the classroom, and that you've got to find ways of bringing joy into that. You've got to love it. It helps if you love it. It helps if you're amused by the things that children do, and take pleasure in the interactions that you have with kids. I think never lose sight of that. I think is really, really important.
Well, we couldn't agree more, particularly from mine and Adam's point of view. And dear listener, Adam has disappeared, so I'm hoping he's on the train somewhere, David, out in the countryside. I think it was Voltaire that said not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Enemy of the good. It was indeed.
And I find myself sitting in that more and more often. When we were looking at launching the podcast, was it good enough to go out? Should we just do it? We've got some universities that are potentially putting it on their reading list. Come and have a listen to what we think is really good for you. But I think that speaks to an ITT or ECT going into their classrooms. You've got to just get in there, have a go, roll your sleeves up. And if you hold yourself back from entering the classroom until you're good enough to do it, I just don't. I think that phrase.
I was rubbish at the beginning. I was absolutely atrocious. And I took to teaching like a like a fridge to water. I mean, it really wasn't pretty, and certainly wasn't something I found instinctive. But I also felt that there wasn't a lot of clarity around me, and that there were people who were asking me, or expecting me to do things, and not really doing a very good job of spelling out what those things were. And I think that seems to be a lot clearer with the ECF now. I think perhaps it's a little bit more burdensome than we intend, and there's probably scope for trimming some of that down somewhat. But in terms of the clarity that's available to young teachers now, I think it's a lot better.
Well, we were discussing in our last episode, we had executive principal for the Oasis Trust, Claire Hudds-Truman, and we were discussing the ability for teachers now to be trained in cognitive science and walking into a classroom knowing, or at least trying their best to understand how children learn and make their lessons reflect that. And she was saying that she'd seen a huge growth in confidence in her trainees walking into the classroom, having a go at something and being very evaluative. I tried this, it didn't really work, so I'm going to try this again now. As opposed to when I started, which was I just walked into a room and went, and hoped that it would work.
I do, to try and keep them in their seats and not throwing stuff.
Absolutely. So with that in mind then, where do you see theory into practice going wrong when it does? The difference between easy and simple, when, or have you had any experience of theory into practice going wrong?
Right. Okay. So there's lots and lots of that, and I think that when I started writing and blogging and all the rest of it, the profession, I think, was mired in an approach to curriculum and pedagogy, which was very much about trying to meet learners where they are and not tell them stuff, and try and restrict the amount of time you spent talking in a classroom, and so I was very much part of a group of people saying, hang on a second, sometimes it's easy just to tell kids stuff, and maybe it's better to make them do things that they don't always necessarily want to do, and we've overcorrected. I very much think that that's true. Yeah. That the dominant paradigm now, I think, in schools is with much too much unidirectional teaching. So when I was talking about the fact that teachers weren't allowed to talk, that was against the context of teachers being told things like when they're in year 7, they can pay attention for 7 minutes, and so you can't talk for more than 7 minutes in a lesson. And think nuts like that, absolute sort of garbage. And people coming in to observe lessons with stopwatches and timing teachers and things like that. And I think we've part of that overcorrection now is that you've got teachers often given permission to, and I think this is particularly the case as a result of the pandemic, and then how we adapted to reopening after school closures, and where we've got a generation of teachers who don't feel comfortable, or haven't been trained, or not really aware of how to get interaction going, and so I think that's something where a lot of good ideas around what's loosely been called sort of the cognitive science sort of bubble or approach or whatever has led to unintended consequences, for sure.
Absolutely. I think when you look at certainly some lessons where you can see the teachers kind of go, well, we don't have any time. That's a huge axiom that's being put out at the moment. We don't have any time, so why are we doing things that the children enjoy when I've just got to get through the curriculum? I've heard that and seen that so much at the moment. And there's no balance, because you can't argue with the fact that there isn't very much time in the classroom, but there's got to be some room for originality and creativity.
I think that's different for I think that's very much different for different phases and different subjects. So if you're a secondary RE teacher, oh my goodness, you've got such limited curriculum time in order to tell a particular story that you've got to think much more carefully about efficiency than if you're a primary teacher or a core subject teacher, where you've got time to loop back on things and go into things in more depth. But sure, I often have teachers say to me that they can't do this or that or whatever the thing is because they've got too much curriculum content to cover. And the obvious response to that is that covering curriculum content, if nobody's learning it, is very much counterproductive.
Absolutely. There's no depth. There's no knowledge. It's just kind of facts that are peddled out.
I mean, I don't really believe that there's anybody just teaching disconnected facts.
I agree. Yeah, it's quite. That's what I mean about the binary nature of Twitter. Yeah. You just see somebody going, "I just have to shout at my kids for an hour," and they learn it, and they go, and then I do it again. No, it's the kind of feeling you get from their argument.
Right. Okay. But I think it's more the case that there isn't enough appreciation of children's prior knowledge, and there isn't enough appreciation that you have to meet them where they are, and to help them make sense of the stuff that you're teaching. And if they can't turn it into something that's meaningful, if they can't make sense of it, then they're not very likely to learn it. So I think that kind of the core of truth around the sort of disassociated facts, the pub quiz argument stuff, is that I don't think it's that anyone's intentionally doing that. It's that we're not appreciative enough, and we're not mindful enough, and we're not potentially, as teachers, maybe we're not skilled enough about deploying strategies in order to help children make meaning.
It is difficult, isn't it? Because, for some of us who've been teaching for quite some time, and you discover some new things, trying to teach yourself your own old dog new tricks, and I'm trying to think about it in a different way, and then you don't have time yourself, but you recognize the importance. So coming across, for me personally, coming across Azubel's work through Sarah Cottingham was a real moment. I've got to tell you, it was a light bulb. It was a smack round the face. Nothing I read particularly was new. I kind of knew it, kind of floated around, but the way it was pieced together was so meaningful that I was able to take it forward and really influence my own teaching.
Sure, and it's when you know that Ausubel was writing in the 60s, and that body of work's been around a long time. Where did it go? How did it get lost? Yeah. And I think that we haven't got good systems within education for conserving important debates and discussions around subjects and around education and pedagogy and sort of assessment and curriculum and all this sort of stuff. We don't have an archive function. We don't have an ability. We don't have institutional memory of these things, that when the oldest teacher kind of retires, like, they take all that stuff with them, and then it's on to when I was writing the prequel, or the book before the current one, Making Meaning for English, and the first chapter of that was very much sort of historical survey as English as a subject, and I found myself reading lots of stuff from the 1920s. Yeah. And just being really, really struck that what was being talked about in the 1920s some of it had only just been rediscovered and represented into the debate. And that's not to say in any way, shape or form that we should teach the way they did in the 1920s. It's just that there were people having discussions about the effects of marking versus whole class feedback back 100 years ago, and that vanished. That disappeared. Nobody knew about it, or very, very, very few people did, and certainly people in schools and didn't. And so for young teachers, finding a route through the thicket of kind of this is how it's done round here, and that sort of all of that sort of stuff is really hard. It's really difficult to ground yourself, I think.
Yeah, I think you just made an excellent point. We don't have a library of Alexandria, do we, of our work where it's all stored and we can go back. I am finding myself being tickled at the prospect of kind of maybe Doug Lamov's great-great-grandfather having a go about clipboards 100 years ago, and people were going, oh, what an absolute nonsense. But if it's always been there. My head teacher, Sally, she rails against anything that comes up that's new, that is just repackaged. She's like, I can't. We did this 10 years ago and it was called this. I think when my wife was training as a teacher, SPAG for about a couple of years was changed to GPS. Yeah. And we're like, oh, no, I'm not. I can't have that. Grammar portrait. Like,
I think it's not necessarily that people are mindfully repackaging things. It's very often people are kind of rediscovering stuff and going, oh, I didn't know about this, therefore I'm going to, tell people about it. And so, I mean, I had this experience recently where I'm quite a fan of the clipboard. I now make it. It's business as usual for me to use a clipboard to help me track what I'm doing in a classroom, because my context is that when I'm teaching, it's almost always kids I don't know, and I'm doing models for other teachers. So I always draw a seating plan and I note down interactions with the kids about stuff that they've said or whether or not they've answered a question, all of that kind of stuff. It's just having a clipboard is just easier than not having one. And a colleague of mine was talking about. She said, "Oh, I do that, and we call it messy mark books, and all the rest of it." And she was talking, and so I wrote a blog post, sort of sharing, what I was doing with what my colleague Claire was doing, and it came back that the whole messy mark book concept it was the brainchild of Christine Council about 15 years ago. And, so this stuff bobbles about. And it's not that it was not that I was trying to sort of claim anything new or special, but what I was aware of was that, I'd never done that before. And I'd never seen teachers do that in lessons before. So it was new to me. And, marvellous that Christine came up with that when she was training history teachers, back in Cambridge all those years ago. But great that practice had, through the ether, sort of connected with me in 2024. But it's important. So that sort of representation of things, maybe sort of blending into rebranding. I think it's a positive thing on the whole.
Well, yes, because I think what we're saying is it's a shame that there is no repository for that knowledge that we can go back and check. Have we said that before? Is that very similar to this? I think we might be.
We need a sort of edgy wiki, don't we? Where you type in messy mark books and it comes up and says, "Yeah, here's all the stuff Christine did on it," and you go, brilliant.
It's like when you're looking for a brand name, or you Google it, don't you? Find out if anybody's used it before, and it can usually spit something back at you that says that's already being used. Don't do it. I do think, though, I've got to applaud you for saying in my context, because it's not something I hear very often. It's something I'm a huge advocate of. My own personal school, there's only 60 young people. We're very small. We're an independent music specialist school. We very, very specific. Just under a third of our students have an EHCP, usually around social, emotional, mental health and autism and that kind of thing. And so a lot of needs are catered for within a class of no more than 10. And I remember saying something on Twitter and being very, very told off for it, because someone had asked a question about positive handling, and I had, full chest gone, don't believe in it. I will never be trained in it, because if I have the skill, then I'll do it. We were a small setting, all that kind of stuff. And somebody came back and was like, check your privilege. I've just Googled your school. You don't know what it's like out there. And what I should have done is prefaced it with for my context. But I find that about other places as well.
It's not that you should. Maybe it's helpful to flag things like that. And I do find myself caveating stuff all the time to quite sort of tedious extent sometimes. But also it's on me to go, hang on a second, let me ask you about your context. Not to bite your head off. And we the idea that we extend to people goodwill, and we extend to them the possibility that, until we know otherwise, that they're well intentioned and thoughtful. I think it's a really useful starting point. I'm a big fan of something called Rappaport's rules. Robert Rappaport was a guy who wrote about sort of argument and debate. And one of the rules that really sort of resonates in my mind is that if you're going to criticise someone else's ideas, that before you do, you should restate them with such clarity and precision that your opponent would thank you and go, "Yeah, you've expressed that better than I did."
Wow.
And I think that's a really important thing. It's something I've really tried to train myself to do.
Yeah, that's brilliant. What was that called again?
Oh, Rappaport's rules.
Rappaport's rules.
I'm gonna fail to spell it now. This is probably something that you'll cut out.
Or we'll leave in for the kind of the realness, the reality of the pod.
Yeah. So what I've got it. Is there a function in your thing for me to send you a? Is there a chat?
Yeah, we've got a chat. Yeah, let me press the chat button. That's exciting.
Yeah, okay. So what I'll do? Oh yeah, I can see the chat button. I will drop a link to that in there, and you can.
Brilliant, because we can put a link in the description for
absolutely,
for all of our listeners.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating.
I wrote, but it was a couple of years ago now. I wrote a blog post which somebody sort of reposted, and I was like, oh, that was quite good. I'd forgotten I'd done that. It was called Educational Dog Whistles and How Not to Blow Them, and
brilliant.
It's one of those sort of evergreen topics that you mentioned there about sort of spag teaching. That if you say spag teaching on Twitter, there'll be a cohort of people for whom instantly their hackles go up and they start sort of frothing, and there'll be another group of people who are instantly sort of like, yeah, absolutely, we should, and the two groups have these kind of pre-made sort of understandings which don't really overlap, and we've got this sort of uncharitable approach to sort of assuming that other people are not, don't share what we've got going on for us.
Absolutely. Well, it's one of the key kind of arguments of against slant. It's one of those things whereby some of my students who really struggle with eye contact, sometimes I do have to remind them to click back into the room, check back, look at me. I know them really, really well. We know each other very well. I know the family, and it's not an offence to ask an autistic person or the autistic person in front of me to just look at me for 5 seconds just so I can get them back in the room. But once again, that's my context. Those are my young people. I know how they work. But the fact that people are like slant is anti-send, and I don't. It just isn't.
Yeah. So slant's something I wrote about in as an example in that post that for some people slant is, and I've put here, I'm quoting myself here, Chris.
Brilliant.
An easy-to-use strategy for reducing low-level disruption and increasing students' attention in lessons. And for other people, it's a nonsensical means of coercively controlling children's bodies, which is tantamount to fascism. And there's no sort of overlap possible in those two extremes, but probably is a bit of overlap. I'll give you a link to that in case.
Yeah, thank you. Very much appreciated. Well, actually, that moves nicely. Just before we move on to your latest book, we were talking earlier about what if everything you knew about education was wrong. Chatting to Adam, we were talking about the fact that we think essentially you make the point that the things you should question most as a teacher are the things you're most certain of. How important do you think that is as a mindset for teachers, either at the beginning of their career? It's a bit like the Dunning-Kruger effect in a way. The more and more you know, the less confident you are about what you know, because the universe just gets infinitely bigger.
Yeah, I think it's not that I think we should always be second guessing yourself, but I think that we've got particular blind spots around certainty, and that whenever we're certain of something, we stop thinking, we stop learning, and that when we sort of are open to the possibility that what's out there might be slightly different to what we expected, and that the outcomes might not be things that we know in advance, then we open up the possibility for seeing something that maybe we weren't aware of before. And so a lovely visual image for this. Do you know about the Necker cube, Chris?
No, go on. I'm very
well, it's
excited.
just-
This is why I was so excited for this interview, because I've just got a pen and paper and I'm writing everything down.
Well, it's not that. So basically, the Necker cube is just it's that sort of 3D representation of a cube, and you can see with the overlapping squares and the lines between it. And so you show people that, and you say, "What can you see?" And the immediate response for the vast majority of people is to go, "That's a 3D cube. I've seen like a zillion of those." Yeah. And that's what you see. But if you then say to people, stare at it intently for about 5 seconds and see if you notice anything unusual happen, that the shape pops. The back wall suddenly becomes the front, and you only see it if you kind of have this kind of openness to experience.
Yeah,
and I think that's, I use that often in sort of talking to people, just to say that there are downsides to certainty. That especially in leadership positions, there's a real bias against uncertainty. We don't want leaders who are going to dither. We want people to sort of make bold decisions. And I think when it comes to things like politics, I think quite literally we'd prefer our political leaders to be wrong than uncertain.
Yes.
And obviously, we suffer from that often. And it's very, very difficult in any kind of leadership position to say, I'm not sure. We need to think about that. What are the possibilities? How might this go wrong? And but only in doing so, I think, do we open up the possibility for making better decisions. Sorry, go on.
No, it's because I see quite a bit of, I guess I'd call it professional intransigence. This kind of, I know this, so I'm not, you can't change my mind, so that's what I'm going to do. And they plow ahead, knocking anything down in their way just because I'm right, so why would I change my mind? And usually these people are also, they're be kind people, but they're also evidence-based, right? And I'm doing this because the evidence says I must. And the irony of that is that evidence changes all the time. I saw an exchange online the other day where somebody called Dylan William out for changing his mind publicly on something, and he kind of replied and went, "Yep, well, I learned something new, so I changed my mind."
I know.
And people couldn't cope with the fact that Dylan William had changed his mind.
Well, that was,
but the fact that he had is the point, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that was what everything you knew about what if everything you knew about education was wrong? That was exactly that. That was about me learning things and changing my mind and discussing the fact that I'd had this, experience. And you're absolutely right. If new facts presenting themselves don't result in you changing your mind, there's something very, very wrong with what's going on. I think a useful thing to sort of to ask ourselves about is, when we're really certain about something, is to say to ourselves, are there any conditions in which I'll be prepared to change my mind? Is there any information? Is there anything out there which, were it true, would cause me to have a change of heart? And if the answer to that question is no, then I think you're speaking from a position of faith. You're not speaking from a position of engaging with curiosity and openness, and you're being dogmatic, and you can't debate and learn with people who have faith-based positions.
Well, I think that kind of moves us on nicely to your new book, Bringing the English Curriculum to Life, which is the kind of the working manual for its predecessor, the field guide for. No, so this is the field guide. Right. This is the field guide for making meaning English. And I came across the book actually as a result of EduPulse being created. Adam and I met doing a master's in educational leadership, and he said, you're in charge of English at your school. Have a listen to an episode of the Education Research Reading Room with Ollie Lovell and a lady called Sam Gibbs, and it's just a great episode. Have a listen to it, and her and Zoe Hellman's book. And I listened to it, and trying not to be dramatic, but I stopped the car several times because it was just saying some things that as we were talking about earlier, just things that I'd never connected. And I was always struggling with our young people. And I said this to them, that idea of the man is looking sadly out of a window and it's a heavy blue velvet curtain and it's raining, and they're all just kind of going, I don't care why it's blue or why it's velvet or what the weather's doing. The author just wrote it, move on.
Yeah.
And when they said in their book there's intrinsic value in meaning making and placing your own meaning onto that velvet curtain, and is it that certain material because it's saying something else and might not have been the author's intention, doesn't matter. And I realized in that moment that English could make people better people. Having a human experience and talking about the human condition through literature and language could just give them a better outlook on life. And in her podcast episode with Ollie Lovell, she said, but please, my book's now a couple of years old. Please go and look at the work of David Didau and what he's doing at the moment. And that's kind of where all of this stemmed from for us and for me personally as an English teacher, because I'd begun to set a concept-led curriculum within school.
Yeah.
And after a term and a half, we had the old Bill come in, bless him, to do us a full inspection. And the Ofsted inspector, I gave them a poem, I gave them Hawk Roosting, and they'd never seen it before. And
the inspector or the children?
Well, she had one as well, yeah. And within 20 minutes, that's all she came to see. They were talking about God and the human connection through religion. And she was like, so how long have you had this poem for? And they said, well, he's only just given it to us. And she was like, no, I don't believe you. And we had a chat afterwards about the curriculum I designed. And she said, I can see some impact already. And then when I got your book, and for listeners, I'm holding it up and waving it angrily in the air. When I read this, and how the application of the earlier you are in school, you learn about early writing. And it just blew my mind, David. So now I'm slightly annoyed because I need to go back and redo everything. But it's going to take years. But I was just so inspired by the fact that you'd done that. The accessibility of the early texts.
So I did quite a bit of discussion with Sam and Zoe before they started writing, and looked at some early drafts, and was involved in in the song on the sidelines. I think I wrote an afterword in their book, actually.
Yes.
But early on in our discussions, we became aware of a sort of a fault line where I thought differently about English concepts than they do.
Mm-hmm.
And we're very amicable about that. I think there's absolutely room. I don't think. Obviously, I believe what I believe, but I don't think that what I think is necessarily right. It's just what I believe, and their approach was different. And I decided, that through talking to them, that I'd write Making Meaning in English, and set out this idea of these 6 conceptual boxes which contain all of the things that you need to know in order to master language and literature. And at the time when I was writing, I wrote it over the lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time I'd been out of classroom teaching for a good few years, working as a consultant, and it was the aggregate of everything that I'd learned about English teaching through visiting schools and talking to people and reading books, and I felt like very pleased with that. I felt very proud of it, but obviously it was highfalutin, pie in the sky, and not had no sort of interaction with the reality of what was going on in schools. So when I had when I was approached to do my current role at Ormiston and bring this curriculum to life, that was really the thing that I was most excited by in having that opportunity to try and make it work. So as you'll know from the front cover, that book was very much a collaboration.
Absolutely.
The majority of the book, but it was very much a collaboration between me and Amy, Dan, Tom, Claire, Emma, Kate, and James, who over various periods of the last 3 years were lead practitioner team, and the discussions that we had, and the attempts that we made, and the failures that we experienced, and all of the teachers and students that we work with across our schools, sort of owe a debt to that process as well. But for me, it's been a most marvelous proof of concept. The fact that it works, and the fact that it's that children who've experienced some of this curriculum seem to have this one great, this appreciation of the subject, which I dreamt would be possible.
Yeah, of course. And we don't, as English teachers, we know we've got that cliff edge that's coming up at GCSE. Literature being one of the strands. We teach both GCSEs at our school, and try to keep them together as much as possible, though it is, as you point out in your field guide, it's not necessarily always possible to have them together, and some settings have to have them separately. And that's a sticky issue for me, because separating the two is a bit like pulling apart two atoms, I guess. That they are, one, particularly in my setting, one feeds the other, and the ability to use language effectively, to be able to, I teach the skill of.
I think it can be. I think the way other systems teach the literature of their own language and the language, the linguistics of their own language. I think that the way it happens in England is certainly not the only way to do it, and in fact, I think we're probably a little bit in the minority sometimes in our approach. So I think there's we need to be open to the fact that there are lots of different ways of doing something great.
Absolutely, I do think that when you are, one of the things that my students sometimes struggle with is unseen poetry, that kind of area there, where they're and we approach that, and have always approached that from the point of view of teaching them skills of analysis that they can take onto anything, unseen poetry, anything that they've never seen before. So as opposed to making unseen poetry the scariest thing, for our students, it's the easiest thing. It's another poem to analyse and talk about what the writer is intending and how the writer has done virtually everything on the paper. Fine, I'll do it like this. And I get them to, one of the exercises I do is I say, I want to see these three things in a little, you got 50 words. What's the best, fastest way, as you, the writer, to tell your audience what you're talking about? And those kind of, for me, reverse tasks have a really good outcome, particularly when you look at GCSE, when they're thrust with the time limits.
I think for me, children's difficulty with poetry comes from the fact that they don't experience very much of it, so it's kind of alien and scary and weird. And the best antidote to that is familiarity. So just seeing, experiencing, and reading a lot of poems, I think is probably more useful than analysing them.
So can I? Well, yeah, exactly. Can I ask then, because it's one of the things that really got my mind working overtime, was the fact that in year 7, in your curriculum, they start with Homer. And kind of you're picking out. It's brilliant. It's so, once again, as with all the best ideas, they're deceivingly simple in concept. How did you go about sourcing the appropriate version of the different texts that are there in the earlier parts of the curriculum?
So, that's something I've been thinking about and iterating for 15 years now. So, I've really been working on that. And I did a classical studies A-level when I was, and loved it, and was, I feel it's a shame that a lot of this is unknown to people, and it's foundational. Some of the stuff in there is foundational to an understanding of English literature, and so we use in year 7 Simon Armitage's play script, radio script called Homer's Odyssey, which is, I really understand why somebody might not want to do it in year 7, because there's a couple of bits of fruity language, there's a couple of F-bombs in it. So, you need to be aware of that and prepared for it. but it's so earthy and accessible and funny that children respond. It's like, for us, it's like the gateway drug to the rest of the curriculum, because teachers will often feel exactly what you've expressed, like, oh my God, you're doing ancient Greek, and we're not at all. We're doing the current poet laureate, filtering these ancient stories in a way which children really respond to and love. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, I think it's hugely impressive and hugely important, because in some of my other roles, you hear school leaders talk about English being the gateway subject, that they don't understand why history marks are so low. If English is so high, maybe there's a disconnect, or is it the other way around? English isn't very high. Can we push knowledge through the rest of it? So sometimes there's a lot of pressure put on the English department.
I'm going to say something controversial now, so
good.
Feel free to ignore it and dismiss it as a ravings of an idiot. But I think in a lot of settings, you could not bother teaching the Key Stage 3 English curriculum and use that time to do like more history, more geography, more other stuff, and children would not suffer from that.
No.
I don't think
that's controversial, because when you look at some of the times,
there's a lot of English teachers who do.
Well, then I encourage them to find us on Twitter at EduPulse, and we can have a bit of a chat about it, because there are some. I'm just thinking off the top of my head now. Year 7, 8, and 9, some schools use that time just to teach the texts that are coming up. I remember when I was at secondary, I did Henry V. I couldn't tell you a thing about it. I did Henry V in year 8, and I'm like, why did I do that? It didn't help. Maybe I could have spent more time in another subject potentially. I don't know. I'm just thinking off the top of my head.
Yeah, well, this is the reason, I think, that the importance for having this idea of mapping the conceptual knowledge that you need for mastery of the subject. So far too much of English at Key Stage 3 is spent reading texts and studying texts and analysing texts, that there's no benefit to children learning. There might be some benefit to them experiencing and enjoying, but there's absolutely no benefit to them analysing those texts and sort of like ripping them apart and doing them to death. And, I think this is the overcorrection stuff that I'm talking about, that very often when you look at the knowledge organiser in an English department for a scheme of work, it's full of like trivia. It's full of stuff which is absolutely irrelevant to giving children the building blocks that they need to get better at the subject.
Yeah.
So the approach that we've taken is very much we're doing that thing English teachers always do, which is talking about texts. And so it doesn't really matter that we start with the Odyssey. You could start anywhere or elsewhere, and it would be, you could have a curriculum that was just as good, better. That's the curated experience we wanted to give the students in our schools. But the important thing is that those texts are vehicles for the conceptual understanding that they need to master in order to be successful at Key Stage 4 and beyond. And so, too often there's either too little or no thought that's really put into what do they need to know that's going to be genuinely valuable, and what's the progression between those things.
I think at my setting, just as we're building and the curriculum is expanding, there's a book maybe in year 7 they'll read, where it covers a concept of friendship and relationships, and we're going to study a section of that book through the lens of storytelling and context.
Okay.
And that those skills might come up later. We won't read the whole book.
Yeah,
it'll be snippets of it.
Okay, so epistemic status alert. I'm going to say something else controversial. That for me, looking at themes like friendship is not English. That's nothing to do with the study of English. It's peripheral to it. That's PHSE. And I think one of the big fault lines in English teaching is that those English teachers for whom teaching English is some variant of PHSE teaching and getting children to sort of empathise with others, And so I've got absolutely no problem with children experiencing text where they discuss friendship, and that can be a way in for all sorts of discussion and interest, and ways to help them make sense of the deep concepts you want them to know. But the concepts that I want them to know are in our terms are metaphor, story, argument, pattern, grammar, and context. And for me, and this was one of the disputes that I think my approach to a concept led English curriculum is quite different to Sam and Zoe's. So in there, they very much do have concepts like that. And for me, I think that there's one of the biggest mistakes we make is that we spend a lot of time teaching themes and no time at all teaching theme. And so themes, plural, gets in the way of teaching the stuff of English. And again, for me, that's vehicular rather than foundational.
Of course. I think as like I said, that what we're doing, we're only a couple of terms in now. And I think with the planning I've been doing with my team, who are wonderful people, are looking at the kind of, how does the author, what do they do to show what vehicles are they using for friendship and relationships? And because it was young, because we go down to year 5, so we're 5 to year 5 through to year 13. So we're trying to pull that through so that by the time they get to GCSE, they're already understanding as much as they can. But your deep concepts, and I've got them in front of me because you've just said the metaphor, story, argument, pattern, grammar, and context.
Yeah.
To put you on the spot, is there one that you think? I mean, you've not done any of them hierarchically.
No, very deliberately.
But there isn't one that you think that's king. That's the most important.
No. They have to be. I mean, I think arguably the context one arguably is the least important. But I think you have to approach them all at the same time. But so that metaphor, which is the first one that I talk about in Making Meaning for English, it's the first one just because it's the first one and you have to put something first, not because it's more important. And that isn't about metaphors, it's about the concept of metaphor. So the fact that, that language is used metaphorically is a key. The thing that you were saying there earlier in the show about that you show kids a line of poetry and they say, why did the writer do this? And they go, he just did. And there, what you've got happening there is students who've not passed through a particular threshold, that they say that because that's how they think and they write. They write something down. Why did you do it? I just did. Whereas when they understand that a writer is making choices in order to influence and manipulate their readers, and that's the key bit underlying metaphor, then everything opens up. The way you read changes, the way you write changes, and so all of that is trying to look at the contents of that metaphor box and try and work out some progression within it.
Well, I think before I came across any of this work on concept-led curriculum, or even things to do regarding kind of concepts being at the heart of it, whatever they are, I was always saying to my students, nothing's an accident. It's all there on purpose. So I'd got my own language. I just wasn't sitting in a particular situation. I was very fortunate enough to have a children's book published last year.
Oh, really?
And that was fascinating. It's called Millie Socks, and it's just about a young girl who has a neurodivergence. And I created a metaphor for that, rain on the brain and butterflies in the tummy, and spoke to a couple of young people with ASD and such. They were like, "Yeah, that's brilliant."
Okay.
And every so often I bring that up into class because I'm like, you're all authors, but I am as well. And I did this, and one young person went, "Oh, so the rain on the brain, because it's raining and she's upset. And the socks she has, the black and red socks, are those the two sides of her life together? Because that's really powerful." And they made my point for me, because I was like, they're just red and black socks. But the fact that they had assumed something that was deeper than I had thought about. To me, that was a special moment.
This is the whole, Roland Barthes, the author's dead, long live the reader. You might not have consciously chosen red and black, but at some level we can all sort of be influenced by the symbology of what it is, what our cultural understanding of those colours is.
But I think what was great was the fact that their minds were open to that.
Yeah, that's lovely.
It wasn't just, it's just a pair of socks, that they put their own meaning onto it, and it was like, okay, we may be getting somewhere here. There may be hope for you yet. What I must say as well about the book, which can be bought, I mean, everywhere. I got mine on Amazon. Can get direct from Routledge as well. It's called Bringing the English Curriculum to Life. Field Guide.
Your book. What's your book?
Oh, my book, Millie Socks.
Millie Socks, brilliant. Okay.
Yeah.
By Chris.
Your
Passey.
book, by Chris Passey. Yeah. I thought you were. No, I'm terrible at trying to sell myself. It doesn't go very well. I thought you were going, what's the name of my book?
Yeah.
But I will say it out loud again for everybody. Bringing the English Curriculum to Life. And one of the things that I really liked about it was the this three-pronged approach that you had: the intent, implementation, and impact. Can you just talk me briefly through that approach? Because I thought it was quite...
I think that's in danger of being a bit passé now, but obviously, back at the beginning of the current inspection framework, somebody in Ofsted Towers sort of noticed that you could look at the way that they were going to be inspecting curriculum and that let's find 3 words all beginning with I. And so when I started thinking about this, during about implementing this, obviously that document was still very much live and current, and maybe it's a bit less relevant or about to be. But anyway, the intent is section talks through our design processes, so it sort of presupposes to a degree some knowledge of the arguments in making meaning, although it recapitulates those if you need that, and then says, bearing these things in mind, these are the choices we make. This is the approach. This is how we did this. This is how we thought about that. And then the implementation section, which is very much the biggest section of the book, is I guess split into 2 things. One of which is what does it look like in the classroom? How do you teach this stuff? How do you teach the writing? How do you teach the reading? How do you get kids speaking? The Englishy stuff. Mm-hmm. Then the other bit of it is how you resource it. So we talk about our approach to resourcing and scaling, and then the impact section is our approach to assessment. And I've been writing quite a bit over the years about my the way I think English should be assessed, and I think that's. It's had a bit of traction. It started, I've really pleased to see increasing numbers of people sort of, getting on board with that. But basically, the big concept there is that we replicate internally in schools endpoint exams like SATs and GCSEs, which by their nature they are discriminatory assessments. Their purpose is to discriminate between children and say that one's better than that one, and we replicate that process in schools, but for no reason. We don't need to do that. Nobody's asking us to, and we probably already know quite a bit of that information, and so we build in unnecessarily competition and people being dispirited and smug and all the rest of it when we don't need to. And so the approach to assessment that we're advocating in the book is, we're calling it mastery assessment, where the intention is to design assessments where it would be possible for anyone taking the assessment to get 100%.
Wow.
It doesn't happen but that's how they're designed, so that if we ask we only ever ask have an assessment task that is explicitly covered multiple times in the curriculum. So that if children can't do it, the purpose of the assessment is not to say, oh, the child can't do it. The purpose is to say more of a QAing of the implementation process, like what went wrong. Was it in the intent section? Is there something wrong with the design, the sequencing of what it is that we're trying to teach? Or was it just not taught very well in this particular classroom? And so using assessment primarily as a tool to make your curriculum better, rather than for judging kids, is, again, we could spend the whole podcast talking about just that one thing, but I think that's one of the most fundamentally important parts of the approach to English that we're recommending.
And advocating so well, because actually one of the most generous things that I think about the book is that it's littered with QR codes with links to resources, which is, there's so much gatekeeping that goes on in some quarters. There's a lot of people on Twitter who are very, very, very generous with their resources. They fill a Dropbox with it and go, I've collated all of the quotes from Inspector Calls that I think you're going to need. Here are the topics it covers.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
Off you go. And they're absolutely amazing. But similarly, to have it in print in your hand and to be able to get that result, was that an important element for the book for you?
So, all of our curriculum materials are freely available on our website. You don't need to buy the book to get them. So if you want to have a look, just english.ormistonacademiestrust.co.uk. You can find everything, and there's not just the resources. There's lots of videos on like how to teach stuff and what certain things look like, and we've put a lot of time and resources into creating that because we want people to use it. So obviously, there are schools in our trust that use the curriculum, but there are schools outside the trust that use it or have adapted it, and there are schools outside the country that are using it. I got contacted a few months ago by a school in North Carolina who got in touch to say, we've been using your curriculum and we've got a couple of questions about the comedy unit in Year 8. And it's like, brilliant. So,
yeah, that's amazing. Well, listen, I think that's a really good point to wrap up our conversation, David. As sad as I am, we like to try and have some bite-sized moments in our podcasts. And I've just thoroughly enjoyed talking all things English to you, and could probably do so for a number of hours. Thank you very much for coming on and giving your time to us today here at EduPulse. Thank you so much for listening to our In Conversation with David Didau. We'll be back soon with more conversations and advice for those of you starting your teaching career, and head-nodding moments with our special guests. As ever, please head over to Twitter and join in the conversation at EduPulse Co, and we'll see you next time.